Hi. Let's see if I can turn this on. Does it work now? No. Does it work now? Awesome. Okay, great. Well, welcome to the post-lunchtime session. That was a nice lunch, wasn't it? And it's a nice warm room. So it's going to be tempting to just take a nap. So that is the task I face, is to try and stop you falling asleep. Okay, if we do that, then we win. So, what I want to tell you about today is something that I've known to be important for a long, long time, which is the relationship between how we speak, so the action part of language, and how we comprehend, the perception part of language. And for like 20 years, I was too scared to touch it. I knew it was important, but I couldn't go there. And then in the last few years, because of some other people who are braver than me, we've managed to start working on this, and it's been really, really interesting. As we go through, I want to highlight that I'm just the spokesperson for some really smart people, and they just send me out to talk to you. These are just some of the people who contributed today. So we'll hear from work by Maggie Kandel, who's now at Harvard, Phoebe Gaston, who's a grad student at Maryland, my colleague Bob Slevak, who's in our psychology department. He was the person who brought language production to us. Julia Buffington, who was my lab manager a couple of years ago. Wing-Yi Chow, who's now on the faculty at University College London. And the star of today is Shota Moma, who is currently a postdoc at UC San Diego psychology, but he'll be starting in a couple of months as a faculty member at the University of Massachusetts. Okay, so broadly speaking, the kind of thing I've been interested in forever is how we can make closer connections between the ways in which we understand language at a high level description that we give in grammatical analyses with the way we think about language when we're carrying out tasks such as parsing or production. And for most of my career, I focused on the relationship between grammar and parsing, and showed in various ways that you could bring those closer together. Awesome. The problem is, if you can't bring production close to comprehension, then what I was doing all this time is a complete waste of time. And that was something that was terrifying me for a long time, because there's all kinds of reasons to think that there are quite a lot of differences between speaking and understanding. So that was like the elephant lurking in the back of the room all the time. Now, as we go through, it's important to distinguish different ways in which we can study a cognitive system. It's important not to confuse the existence of different tasks. So speaking and understanding, they are different tasks, no question. That's not to be confused with different levels of analyses. You can look at the same cognitive system and describe it at multiple different levels of analyses. And you can also just have different cognitive systems. So it's clear that speaking and understanding involve different tasks. What we're really interested in is whether they actually entail different mechanisms, okay, that carry out, that are dedicated to those specific tasks. And the kind of position that we've been trying to advance is that the same cognitive system can be used in multiple task settings, and just under different conditions of uncertainty, with different types of information withheld. So parsing is just the name we give to a task where we withhold information about what is the intended meaning. That's the part you have to fill in. And production is the name we give for a task where, well, something else is withheld. You know the meaning, but we withhold information about the intended form, and that's what you have to fill in. And then there are other situations where you know the intended form and you know the intended meaning, and you just have to say whether they go together, and that's the sort of thing that normal humans don't do, but it's what linguists spend all their time on. They call it judgment studies. But they're really just all ways of you examining the same ability to link up sounds and meanings, sometimes with different meaning withheld, different information withheld. Okay, so the received wisdom is that there are many differences between speaking and understanding. So there's good reason to think that maybe the order in which you work with information is different. Maybe you go about putting together sentences in different orders, and you have flexibility in how you put things together in a sentence. If you look at the literature, you find that people tend to often focus on different phenomena. There are different assumptions about different size of the grain size of the units you work with. So in comprehension, it's pretty much uncontroversial that you work with small pieces, bit by bit. But in production, it's a live possibility that you actually plan things in rather large chunks. And then if you look through the literature on language development, or neuropsychology, and all kinds of different areas, there's a bunch of different dissociations that seem to distinguish what is targeted by comprehension problem versus production problem. So there's lots of reasons to think they're different. But we're working on trying to pull these away, okay? So what I'm going to be talking about here is an overview of it is summarized in the paper that Shota and I published last year in annual reviews. And a thing we highlight here is that there are different ways in which you could have speaking and understanding be the same. Okay, so the first thing, which we refer to as representational identity, is what more or less everyone assumes to be true, which is that whether you speak and understand the same language, and so however you get to the representations, the ones you construct in speaking and understanding are the same. That's not completely uncontroversial, but it's pretty much everyone's starting position. The next possibility, which is a stronger claim, and that's the one we'll be most interested in here, is what we call mechanistic identity, and that is the notion that not only do you construct the same representations, but you construct them in the same way, meaning the way in which you use available information to obtain the missing information uses the same mechanisms. That doesn't actually, the strongest, that doesn't commit you to you doing things in exactly the same order, because you have different information you start with. Okay, so that could be responsible for various differences. The strongest claim, which is what we call algorithmic identity, which would be the notion that not only do you use the same mechanisms, but you use the same mechanisms to build the same representations in the same order, whether you're speaking and understanding. That's probably too strong. In fact, it's almost certainly too strong, but it's not as wrong as we thought. Okay? So what I want to highlight here as an important point for thinking about this is that when you're speaking and understanding, there are different things you know and don't know. So there's different loci of uncertainty. So this is fairly obvious if we think about things you know about words. So you know this is a cat. Imagine this picture is a stand-in for the concept of cat. You know the cat has sound associated with the word, and you know it has some syntactic properties, like it's a noun and that combined with other things to form a sentence. And we know that if you're speaking the word cat, or if you're understanding the word cat, there are different things that can go wrong, there are different points of vulnerability, different things will interfere with that. But we don't say that, oh, therefore you have multiple lexical entries for cat. We just say, well, yeah, you have the same body of knowledge you have about that word, and when you get at that from different directions, you have different vulnerabilities, okay? And so basically that's the idea we want to apply at the sentence level. Okay, so now let's apply this to something which involves much more than individual words. So that is the way in which we form questions, which is one of the kinds of things that linguists like to spend a lot of time on. So in English you can ask a question like, who did John say that Mary saw? Where that is a question you're asking for information, and what you're asking about is the object of the verb see. So who is it that got seen? Okay? And in English, that's the way you form questions. And different languages do this in different ways. So English does it one way, and other languages do it different ways. So this is how this might show up in Mandarin. So in Mandarin, you would have Mary knows, Yuehan, that's a name, what? So in Mandarin, the question word, that will be sitting next to the verb that it's related to, that's close to its direct object. And the fact that this is a question is not marked by moving the WH word to the front as it is in English. I think Turkish is more similar to this, right? Yeah. So it means that there's different information that is made available overtly or that you have to fill in depending on your language. So in any language, you have to figure out what's the scope of the question. So is it a direct question or an indirect question? English marks that overtly with word order. Mandarin, and I think Turkish, don't. Okay? On the other hand, you also need to figure out, well, what is it you're asking about? What is the thematic role? And that's something where English doesn't mark that overtly. You have to figure that out. And Mandarin and Turkish do. Okay, so different information is provided. And the other thing you need to know is, well, what is the intervening structure between the scope position and the thematic position? Okay, so there's different things you know and don't know based on what the language makes available. Okay? So if you're in English, then something we know in comprehension in English is you encounter a WH phrase like what or who, and you will immediately know I've got a direct question, but there's other things you don't know. You've got to go and figure out what is the thematic role. You've got to go and figure that out as fast as possible. And we know that what you do is you go and try to find the first possible verb that you can hook up with. So kind of evidence for that is, imagine you have a sentence like this. So how many students did the school expand the classroom for? Okay, so you can read that reasonable sentence. But if we measure your reading time, when you get to this verb expand, you're going to slow down. Or if we put electrodes on your head, you'll act surprised at various things, you'll boggle in various ways. Because you try to take this phrase initially as the object of expand, and you don't normally expand students. It's not very ethical. So that's how we know that what you try and do is you try and fill in this at the first possible opportunity. Now, if you're doing this in Mandarin or Turkish, there's different information you have available, right? So in Mandarin, you encounter the WH phrase, and you immediately know the thematic role, but you don't know the scope. And what we know from experiments on Mandarin speakers, I don't know if this has been done in Turkish, is then you can see people undergoing processes of trying to figure out what the scope is. Okay, so different things you're available. So yeah, this would be the corresponding Mandarin sentences. We don't need to worry about that. Okay, so that's, in comprehension in different languages, there's different things you know and don't know. Now, what about what happens in production? Okay, so in production, you know the message, because you know the scope of the question, you know whether you're asking a direct or an indirect question. You know the thematic role, hopefully, because you know what you're asking about. But what you don't know is what is the structure that connects them, that comes between those two. And so that's the thing you figure out once you've got the form. So even though you know these two critical pieces, when you go and figure out the structure, you may find some surprises. So we can try this out. I don't know how this is going to work with you guys. So if I say at the top, so this is a donkey that lives in California, okay? This is a donkey that lives in Brazil, okay, good. And this is a donkey that I don't know where it lives. Okay, that's how you do it in English. And so what goes on here, you know the scope in the thematic role, you don't know the intervening structure, and in English, what happens is you can't say, this is a donkey that I don't know where lives. That's impossible in English. That violates a structural constraint in English. You have to add an extra pronoun in there. And what you can see, this is from a study by Ben Swetz and Fernando Ferreira from a few years ago, is as people are going through saying the sentence, at some point they'll slow down when they realize, oh crap, I'm not going to be able to have a gap for the thematic role, I'm going to have to add a pronoun, and you can see when that enters their plan. So that reflects the different things they do and don't know. Okay? So that's a different sort of surprise. Okay, so this is an illustration of the kinds of different sorts of uncertainty you'll have, and what we want to know is how much of this can capture the differences we see between comprehension and production. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to give you a series of little examples of things different things we've done, looking at production and comprehension, sometimes finding out that they look different on the surface, but they're more similar underlyingly. Sometimes we're able to put things together, show that apparent differences aren't as different as we thought they were. And then the last thing I'll show you is something where it seems that they're more different than we expected, and we're still trying to figure out how. Okay? So the first thing I want to do, this is work that I did with Shota and Bob. This is something which had troubled me for a long time. As was mentioned at the start, so my first degree was in modern languages. I was a student of German, medieval German. And one thing that German does, which is like Turkish, is it has verbs at the end of sentences. Okay? And for a speaker of English, that's kind of problematic. Okay? And I was curious, well, what does that mean for the processes you go through in planning and understanding? And also, over many years, I've had some wonderful Japanese students, so we've done a lot of projects on Japanese. Now, so the question at hand is, what happens when the verb, which is very important, is the last thing you're going to say? This is actually something which has troubled psycholinguists since the 19th century. So here are two famous 19th century psycholinguists. So Wilhelm Wundt is mostly known for his contributions to psychology. Mark Twain is less known for his contributions to psycholinguistics, but he actually made some important contributions. most notably in a paper or an essay called The Awful German Language, which if you haven't read, you should, and it's much more entertaining to read than most psycholinguistics papers. Okay? So he's talking here about the fact that in German, and you can probably construct something similar in Turkish, you can have subjects, this is a subject, this pronoun here, he, and then the verb that goes with that subject is all the way over here. Okay, they can be very, very far apart. And so he says, well, this is from this source by Mrs. Marmot, and he says, well, that's constructed on the most approved German model. You'll see how far that verb is from the reader's base of operations. Well, in a German newspaper, they put their verb way over on the next page. And I've heard that sometimes after stringing along the exciting preliminaries and parentheses for a column or two, they get in a hurry and have to go to press without getting to the verb at all. And of course, then the reader is left in a very exhausted and ignorant state. So this is Twain's formulation of the problem that we were interested in. And I don't know if you have intuitions about this. So as speakers of Turkish, the possibilities are, well, we know verbs are kind of important. So either you figure out the verb early on, and then, because you can't say it until the end, you just hold on to it, like, okay, hold the verb, and then you say it at the end. Or, you just say all the other stuff and then pray that when you get to the end, you're going to find a good verb. Okay, I'll take the laughter as a vote for hypothesis A. Okay. However, there's really interesting evidence from German that hypothesis B is correct. Okay. And so this is what got us interested in this. Okay, so we get to do some audience participation here. So I'm going to show you the way we can figure out what people are planning when. Okay, and you can do this using a version of a well-studied task called picture word interference. So I'm going to flash a picture up, and you're going to shout out clearly what the word is. Okay, and it's probably better that you do this in English, because then I can hear whether you're getting it right. Okay, so you need to be quick. Okay, ready, go. Good. Okay, right. Now we get to do another one, but I want you to be a bit faster this time. You weren't quite fast enough. That was good for after lunch. Ready? Go. No. You slowed down. And you slowed down, obviously, because you were retrieving the word dog, but I interfered with you with the word cat, right? And that's how picture word interference works. This is a semantic distractor. You can also have a phonological distractor, dog, duck, or you can have a baseline condition like dog, rice, and that's where you compare slowdown for the related conditions versus the unrelated conditions. Okay? Very widely used technique in language production. This has nothing to do with sentences yet, but how this gets into sentences is in the following elaboration of this, which Antje Meyer thought up 20 years or so ago. Antje Meyer is now one of the directors of the Max Planck Institute in Nijmegen. So what Meyer came up with was the idea that you could just elicit from people phrases or simple sentences, like the arrow and the bag, or the arrow is next to the bag. And what you're interested in is when people start to speak when they're going to say the arrow, you interfere with them with an associate of the bag. Okay? If you haven't planned the bag, it behaves like a control condition, it shouldn't let it go. If you have planned the bag, then it will slow you down. Okay, so when you're saying this, will you be slowed down by an associate of this? And the finding is you are. Okay? Now, the extension of that to German, which was done shortly afterwards by some colleagues of mine, is they were eliciting verb final clauses in German, and what they found in German is when you're saying a subject, you behave as if you have not planned the verb. Okay? So that people were describing simple scenes like these. And across 5 experiments, very well conducted, what they seem to find is that, yeah, at the point of the subject, you haven't planned the verb. And so the conclusion they draw is Germans just wing it. They say stuff and then hope that the verb is going to be okay, which Germans find surprising. So we wanted to look into this in more detail, and we can do this, we can get at this more closely using Japanese. Because Japanese allows us to start sentences in different positions. So this is, someone's cleaning the window, wiping the window, and the appropriate description of this is fuku, but this word says kosuru, which means rub, and you don't do that to windows in Japanese, okay? So we can interfere with people just before they're saying an object, or we can interfere with them just before they're saying a subject. This is a dog barking, and before they say dog, you can interfere with them with this the Japanese word naku. Dogs don't cry, dogs bark. Okay? And so we can see what did they plan before the subject, what did they plan before the object. Okay? So first, we just had people say the verb only, just to make sure that our distractors were working. Would the distractors slow them down for the transitive or the intransitive verbs? Yes. So the materials work. Then we had an experiment where we just had them say the noun, like the dog or the window, to make sure that the distractors weren't related to those, and there was no slowdown in either condition. That was fine. Then the money condition was when we had people say the sentences, and there we got a sharp contrast between what happened in the subject's initial sentences. We found exactly the same thing found in German. So when Japanese speakers are about to say the subject, they behave as if they haven't planned the verb. But when they're about to say the object, they have already planned the verb. Okay, so they're planning ahead, but not all the way to the start of the sentence. Okay, so it's neither hypothesis A nor B, it's something in between. You do plan ahead, but not all the way. Okay? So subsequently we wanted to extend this to figure out, well, why there's this contrast between subjects and objects. So we were able to get at that using actives and passives in English, because that allows us to distinguish whether what matters is really subject versus object, so grammatical functions, or whether what really matters is the thematic semantic notions of agents or agents and patients. And so we can do that in English. So if you take it something like this can be described as the chef is chasing the ballerina, or as the ballerina is being chased by the chef. Okay, with an active or a passive. And you can interfere with the verb stalk, and this is much more than stalking at this point. Okay? And what we find here is a similar finding to what we see in German and Japanese. So in an active sentence, people are not slowed down in saying the chef with an associate of the stall. So they behave as if, in this case, they haven't planned the verb when they say the subject. But in the passive, even though the verb is phonologically further away, they have planned the verb. Okay? So it's something about the thematic role, the semantic notion of agent versus patient. And we get this, so we get the same contrast. Third thing we did then is we thought, okay, well, let's go one step further. This is something for the linguist to appreciate. So we took different types of intransitives in English, because English intransitives, some of them have agent subjects, and some of them have patient subjects, okay, even though they have exactly the same form. So the ones with agent subjects are called unergatives, the ones with patient subjects are called unaccusatives. And there, we did the same thing, and we found the same contrast. So when people are about to say the subject of an unergative verb with an agent subject, they haven't planned the verb. When people are about to say the subject of an unaccusative verb, that's a patient, they have planned the verb. So the same thing that happens in German, same thing that happens in Japanese. What seems to happen is, in production, you plan ahead, and what you plan when seems to be quite tightly governed by the thematic roles of the argument that you're saying. Okay? To a degree that we found surprising. Okay, so that's the production side. Now let me flip to comprehension. Comprehension? Yes, I am. Okay, so here what we wanted, quite independent of this, we were working on some studies on the role of thematic roles in comprehension and in prediction. And this is work which started with work I was doing with Alan Lau, my colleague at Maryland. And the key discoveries were made by Wing-Yi Chow. I'll show you more results from Shota, from Japanese, because the Mandarin is hard to understand. But Wing-Yi really made the key discovery. Okay. But before we get to that, we get to do more audience participation. Okay? So you get to do some math problems. Okay? So, what's this? What's the answer? Sorry? Just joking, yeah. So, I ask you this and you laugh at me, okay? That's the answer. It's like, that's too hard. Okay, so if that's too hard, try an easier one. So what's the answer to this? So this one's easy, right? This is 1,998, okay? And what's the answer to this one again? It's the same. It's 1,998, okay? So these two expressions both entail 1,998 with the same probability, right? So they have the same consequences, but this one, you laugh at me because it's too hard. And this one, you laugh at me because it's insultingly easy. Okay? So what this shows is that what that your entailments and their probability is not a predictor of the difficulty of figuring this out. That's obvious in the case of math. It's not so obvious in the case of language, but that's one of the things I want to demonstrate here. Now, let's take a language example. So, take something like this. So, Englishmen are well known for their dedication to ale. Ale, good, okay. The Queen, cricket, Europe. I wish. So you get lots of different answers, right? This one never comes up, and some strangely. So one thing we know is you're very sensitive to different ways in which a sentence can continue. There are high likelihood continuations, there's very low probability continuations. And one thing we also know is that if you measure people's electrophysiology when encountering high or low probability words, there are quite characteristic responses you'll encounter. So something that was demonstrated a long time ago, this is nearly 40 years old, is if you compare the ERP responses to sentences like, I drink my coffee with cream and sugar, where sugar is very likely, or I drink my coffee with cream and socks, where socks is not likely, then there's a very characteristic response to the unlikely word socks. It's called an N400. That stands for the fact that it's a negative deflection in the ERP. Negative is up, and it has a latency of about 400 milliseconds. It's very, very reliable. There's literally hundreds of studies demonstrating this. And what we know now is it's not just a stream of pain, it's something that happens, it's every word that you, every open class word, so every noun, verb, adverb, adjective that you encounter elicits an N400. It's happening to you now. It just gets bigger or smaller depending on how expected or unexpected the word is. And it's really big for a word like socks here because it's very unexpected. Okay? So basically, the size of the N400 tracks the closed probability of a word. So the closed probability is the probability that that word will appear in context. Okay? So if you have, he was stung by a bee, bee is very high close, it has a very small N400. You know, he was stung by a wasp, that's plausible but less likely. You have a larger N400, he was stung by a fly, it gets bigger. So it gets bigger and smaller based on closed probability. Very, very reliable finding. Literally, you know, hundreds of findings like this. Okay. So now we're going to you get to play once more. Okay, so I'm going to read a sentence to you, and you're going to complete it. Okay, as quickly as you can, and I want you to shout it out. And again, please try and do it in English because then I can understand what you're doing. Okay, so the gardener talked as the barber trimmed the. Okay, right. Yes, good. Yes. So we heard lots of trees, hedges, things like that, and no. So the subject of trim is barber, right? You should have beards, moustaches, things like that. But what you did, and this will happen for native speakers as well, they're worse at it than you, is people will give you things like hedges and trees related to the gardener. So what you've come up with there is you've come up with a completion for the sentence under pressure, which is a word associated with the words in the sentence, but it's not really following the finer details of which noun is the subject of which verb, okay? And so under time pressure, you'll make mistakes like that. And in fact, this is related to something which is quite well documented now in the electrophysiological literature, is if you take sentences like the following, so like the thief that the cop arrested. Arrest is quite likely, so the cops arrest thieves, that's arrest is a very high close group. Or the cop that the thief arrested there, that should be very low close, because thieves shouldn't be arresting cops. So they're very different in their probability. You should get a big difference in the N400 response, but you don't. They elicit the same N400 response, despite the fact that one's quite plausible and the other one is crazy. Okay, and this is something that seems to be the brain response is not sensitive to the different predictability of those words. And this is not a one-off finding. This is something which has been shown many times in many languages, in English, Dutch, Spanish, Mandarin, Japanese, lots of languages, quite reliable finding. It's not that people, I should clarify, it's not that people fail to notice that this is weird. People notice. is that that particular part of the brain response does not notice. Okay, so the N4, people notice, the N400 doesn't. Okay, and so it seems to be, there's so it would be interesting, well, why is it that in this case, people aren't so sensitive? So what I want to show you is something that we've done in multiple languages now, looking at the effect of timing on how people become sensitive. Okay? And I'll show you a Japanese example, but as I said before, we first found that this was first found by Wing-Yu Chow in Mandarin. I'll just show you the Japanese because it's easier to understand. Okay? So imagine you have simple sentences in Japanese like be, nominative, sting. Sting is very likely to be nominative. If you change the case marker to accusative, to be accusative sting, sting is very unlikely. You don't sting leads. Okay? And you can have fish accusative catch, that's very likely, typos. Fish nominative catch, not so likely. So you can just create the equivalent of one of these role reversal sentences simply by flipping the case marker. Okay? And what we also do is, so we took the noun with the case marker and the verb and varied the amount of time between the noun and the noun and the verb. Okay, so people had the same amount of information, they simply had more or less time to work with it. Okay, so this is what it would look like in Japanese. In fact, you have either 800 milliseconds latency or 1200 milliseconds latency. And what we find is when the verb comes soon after the noun, the case marker manipulation makes no difference. You get the same N400. It's as if the verb sting is just as expected after be nominative and be accusative. Okay? You're just sensitive to lexical associative. But if you move the verb further away, you just have the same information for more time, then you get an N400 contrast. So this is the lack of N400 contrast when the verb is close to the noun. This is how it grows when you just add a bit more time. Okay? So simply having more time allows you to get a more precise prediction that takes into consideration the case information. So what do we think is going on here? Well, what you've got to do is, what you're effectively trying to do in this task is you're doing things like when you answer questions like this, like what do bees do? Or what gets done to bees? So when I ask you what do bees do, I'm saying, tell me a verb that takes be as an agent. Or if I'm saying, what gets done to bees, tell me a verb that takes bees as a patient. And you should come up with different verbs for that. Okay? And what you have to do to answer that is engage in a kind of memory task in order to search, in order to predict the verb. So prediction is a kind of memory search, and lexical prediction is a semantic memory search. And given something like be accusative, the question is, what do you have to do to predict SWAT instead of sting? Okay? And what we think you're not very good at doing is using the combination of the argument role information and the lexical information from the argument role information from the case, the lexical information from the noun, together as in one-step lexical search to find SWAT rather than sting. What we think you do is you go through a multi-step process where you're first generating lexical associates of sting, of B rather, and then once you've got those, then you can sort through those to figure out which things are going to be consistent with the argument roles. And that's something that takes a bit more time. So it's a bit similar to what happens if you're doing something like this problem. Okay, you've probably seen these, right? So these are like, where's Waldo in English? And what's he called in Turkish? Yeah, that thing. So the reason why these are hard is because you can't look for the combination of red and white stripes and his facial features directly in one step, right? If you could, there will be zero money to make from these Where's Waldo books. The reason why you can make money is because what you can do in one step is you can access red and white stripes, and then you have to serially search through the red and white stripes candidates to find the more complicated features. By the way, Waldo is over there. If I don't say that, people don't listen to what I'm saying. and I couldn't find him either, I had to go look it up on the internet. Okay, so what we think happens is when you encounter a word like be with a case mark, you can easily and automatically generate a bunch of lexical associations. Like sting, buzz, insect, honey, pain, etc. And we think you can also narrow down to the verbs right away. But what you have to then do more laboriously, and that takes more time, is sort through the different candidates to figure out which one fits with the case marker. That's what you can't do in one step. Okay, so in production and comprehension, what we see is in production, argument roles tightly govern the time course of the plan. In comprehension, it seems like verb prediction is initially blind to argument roles. That's what we find in these studies and in other studies as well. So why would they differ? It looks like a basic contrast. Well, I think the difference is you have different starting points in the two cases. So in production, you're starting with a message, and that will take you straight directly to the verb. Okay, and once you get to the verb, then you have easy access to that verb's participant roles, kinetic roles. And comprehension, especially in a verb final setting like we created in English, and like you would have in Japanese or Turkish, what you're doing in this prediction task is you're given nouns and abstract argument roles, and you're using that to try and access the verbs. And that's something you can't do in one step. That requires a multi-step process where you first generate associates of the nouns that are verbs, and then sort through them. Okay, so as time is going on, what I think I want to do is I want to skip some stuff on memory access, where this was the stuff I was going to tell you about memory access involves apparent comprehension, production, contrasts that we found to be similar, after all, but the more interesting things are these cases involving category constraints. And this is cool findings in each domain. They don't exactly align between comprehension and production, but maybe you can help me figure this out. This is work that the production set was done with Shota and Bob, and the comprehension work was done with Phoebe. Okay, so the starting point for this is something that's been known for a while, is when you're speaking, you will sometimes make errors. So you might say something like, I'm mailing a mother to my letter. When mother and letter get exchanged. And then different things happen whether you produce the wrong word or words show up in the wrong spots. That happens a lot under pressure, maybe happens when you're giving a talk. But we know that not everything can exchange with everything. Something that's well known is that nouns exchange with nouns and verbs exchange with verbs. So things of the same category tend to exchange. Okay? And that's been well known since the 70s. It's not entirely clear why. Is it really something syntactic, or is it something which is based on just the fact that nouns tend to have more similar meanings and verbs tend to have more similar meanings? So what we wanted to do is get at this in a more constrained way in the lab, that you can study in speech error research. So what we wanted to do is use a version of the picture word interference paradigm, which we've seen before. You know, if you have to say cat when I'm distracted with dog, then you'll be slower to say cat with a dog distractor, okay? But what we wanted to do is a version of this where we're carefully controlling the category of the word. Okay? So take a word like run. Now, run can be a noun or a verb, right? And so this is someone walking, and we wanted to see whether you'd be distracted by running and whether that matters whether it's a noun or a verb. Now the problem is if I put run like this, you don't know whether it's a noun or a verb, so it doesn't matter. Okay? So what we came up with is a new way of testing this, which allows us to give finer control over the syntactic properties of the distractor. So what you have to do in what we call the sentence picture interference task is first you memorize a sentence. So you just told memorize this sentence, and it goes blah 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 blah. You just go, okay, ready. And when you're ready, you press a button, and half of the time you're told repeat back the sentence. And that's why you perform a memory task. So you say the sentence back. And we don't really care about that. Or we care about that only because that gets something in memory. What we really care about is the other half of the time, a picture comes up and you describe it. But what it means is we have people describing a picture like this, she's walking, while they have in memory something from this other sentence. And we can carefully control what's in this other sentence. So for example, we can have people say she is walking when they memorize either Mary is amazed that they are tirelessly running. Running here is a verb. Or Mary is amazed by their tireless running, where running is a noun. So running has the same phonological form, it has the same meaning, but in the first case it's a noun, it's a verb, in the second case it's a noun. And we're interested in, would those disrupt saying she's walking in the same way? And the answer is no, not at all. So in fact, we find this quite shocking. So if you're saying she is walking, and running is in memory as a verb, you get slowed down. Standard interference effect. But if you have running in memory with the same meaning, same sound, but it's a noun, you have no distraction. It doesn't slow you down at all. Even though it looks and sounds the same. Okay? So the category seems to make you blind to the semantic overlap. You know, we were worried that maybe this is just because this construction with this gerund is a bit weird, so we wanted to flip this around, to have people describe a sentence, say a noun, and we can do that by just, surprisingly easily, we give people, add a little bit of color to the picture and say, okay, if you see this, imagine you're in a synesthesia situation, and say something like, her walking is blue. And people will do anything for $10. And so they say, okay. And so they do exactly the same task with the same things in memory, and what happens is the result's reversed. So now they're slowed down if running is a noun, and not slowed down if running is a verb. Okay? So you can, in production, what you see is that even though these words are semantically very similar and would normally interfere, if they're in the wrong category, it's as if it's not there at all. Okay, which is quite striking. So finally, what I want to do is show you the comprehension version of this, where what we expected was the comprehension would do the same thing. Okay? So in comprehension, the question again is in comprehension, when you're hearing a word in a context that tells you whether it's a noun or a verb, will you consider interpretations of that word that are of the wrong category? So if you have something like, she chose to burr, this is the start of the word, or she chose the burr. So in the first one, it signals that word is going to be a verb. And in the second one, the context signals that it should be a noun. Okay? And the question is, in that context, will you only consider verb meanings as this unfolds? Will you only consider noun meanings as this unfolds? This question has been around for quite a long while. People have looked at it over the years in many different ways. And there are actually kind of conflicting results in the literature. There's much more to be said about that. I can talk about it afterwards. But the way that we went about it is in what I think is a better way than it's been done in the past, is we had people in a simple situation where people are looking at a display, they have simple objects in front of them, and we're measuring their eye movements as they're looking at different parts of the display. And in a simple control condition, which is not what we care about, they would hear things like, she chose the broom. Okay? And if you hear she chose the broom, they would look at the broom. No surprise, that's not interesting. What we're interested in is what happens in a situation like she chose the brownie. Okay? In this one, there is no brownie in the picture. So and people are supposed to say, there's nothing in the picture related to this. But the word brownie begins with the same sound as broom. Okay? And would people look to broom in this picture because they have this temporary overlap? And the answer is they do. So you'll see, so just as that word unfolds, people's eyes will be attracted to the broom because they think they might be hearing that. And then the counterpart to that is, she chose to browse. Okay, so she chose to browse. You have a context which clearly says that it's going to be a verb. You get verb the onset, and you've still got broom here. Would people be drawn to look at that? And the finding is, in fact, they are, just as much. So whether they're hearing she chose the brownie or she chose to browse, their eyes move towards broom, which they don't hear equally as much in both cases. So it's like they're not following, the category constraint is not actually constraining what they look at, which we found surprising, but it seems to be quite reliable. Okay, so what's going on here is, so we seem to find different effects of the category constraint in comprehension and in production. So in comprehension, we have a sound of an incoming word that initially matches the name of a picture in a visual array. And we have category information that comes from the preceding linguistic context. And what we find is that despite the constraining information from linguistic context, the category fails to block the match between sounds and the name of the picture. Okay, so that fails to override that link. Okay? In production, what we find in contrast, so the semantic features of a visual prompt, like a picture of someone walking, they overlap with features of a word in memory, like running. Okay? And the category information comes from the word in memory. So the word in memory is wrapped up in some syntactic structure. And it also comes from the production frame, so you know you're producing a sentence with a certain frame. And even though the words have clear overlap in their semantic features, you find no delay in speech, as if they're unrelated words. Okay? So what we find in production is kind of useful because it allows you to target words from the right category and not be distracted by words from the wrong category. But when we line up what we find in production and comprehension, it's sort of surprising because one is subject to shows cross-category interference, the other one doesn't. Now, it could be that what we conclude from this is, well, that just shows there's different mechanisms involved. But I think that's probably unlikely. The notion that you're accessing memory in the two cases using different systems, one that's designed for production, one designed for comprehension, seems unlikely. So what must be the case, I think, is that the way in which the different source of information is presented to you is different and is differentially effective at blocking off your recognition of the similarity. And we need to do more studies to get to the bottom of this, but I suspect that what's critical is this part about the production, is that when you're in the production task, your word in memory is coming with its category added to it and, say, a noun. And when you're producing, you've got a frame that tells you you've got a verb. And something about how those things are encoded in memory are helping to block those from interfering with each other. But we need to do more to figure out why these contrast. I'm probably out of time, right? When did we start? Sorry? 7 more? Oh, okay. Oh, well, I think I skipped. I could do. Okay, so this is fun. So I can talk about the memory access thing that I thought we wouldn't have time for. So this is a case where there were areas that we thought were contrasting but seem to be more similar than before. So there's comprehension work done by Brian Dillon, who's now at UMass Linguistics, and the production work that was did with Maggie Candela, who's now a grad student in Harvard. And what we're interested in here is, what is the memory architecture used for accessing information and speaking and understanding? And how do you use those mechanisms and different types of cues to access information in memory, okay? And so the starting point for this is something that's well known from both, certainly in production, but also in comprehension. So something that happens all the time in English is people make mistakes with the agreement on verbs. So if you have a sentence like, the key to the cabinets are on the table, okay? So I don't know how that sounds to a Turkish speaker, but it sounds pretty good to an English speaker, even though it's bad. Okay, so the subject of the sentence is key, but if you put another plural here, so the key to the cabinets, then the verb will often agree with the plural cabinets, even though it shouldn't. Okay? People will say that often without noticing. If you give it to them in comprehension, they will fail to notice the error. It's not all the time, but just a lot of the time. And sometimes you can even see, so that now that you have newspapers get published overnight, and then before the print edition comes out, you'll sometimes be reading the New York Times one evening and you'll see an agreement error, and then by the morning it's been fixed because the editors will come in and found problems. It's not just, so this happens all the time, it's not just a matter of verbs agreeing with the word that's next to them. Also, in situations like this, people will make lots of mistakes. Like the musicians who the reviewer praised for their skill will win an award. So here, the verb praise should agree with the reviewer, which is right next to it. But when you stick another plural over here, that is enough to confuse people, and they'll get the agreement wrong. In fact, just as often as in this case. So people are very fragile. Okay? That's well known. Now, something that is less well known is you might expect to get the same problems involving the relationship between pronouns, like themselves, and subjects. Okay, so pronouns need to agree in number with subjects, but they might also be disrupted by other plurals kicking around. So, like the diva that accompanied the harpists presented themselves. Now, but this themselves should agree with diva. People do not get tripped up in comprehension by this plural. They're protected against that. Whereas they fall for it all the time with agreement. And there's a lot to be said about this, and that it seems to be the ways in which we use cues to access information in memory for plural agreement is different when we're computing relations for pronouns and when we're doing it for plural agreement. Fine. That's a whole other talk. But the thing that's interesting here is something that's been reported in production is that people actually screw up in both cases in production. So the actor in the soap opera's blurred. That's a mistake that people will make. But it's also reported by K-Buck that people would say things like, the actor in the soap operas watch themselves, where themselves should agree with actor, but it mistakenly agrees with soap operas. That's kind of weird. That people will say these things that don't really make much sense. But this has normally been done in a paradigm which is kind of unnatural, where people are given sentence fragments all the way through to watched, and then told just add the pronoun at the end. And they're like, okay. So what we wanted to do is look at these cases in a more naturalistic side-by-side fashion, where naturalistic means we have people talk about aliens. What happens here, to elicit agreement, we have people talking about scenes involving different types of aliens. There's greenies, blueies, and pinkies. And they perform these nonce actions, which is called miming. Okay, so let's see if this works. So, right, so the green is miming, the blue is miming, and the pinky is miming. Okay, great. So you can use that to create different sorts of scenarios. And so you might see a scene like this where you've got a pinky above some greenies. Okay? And so if you're describing this, you might say, the pinky above the greenies is miming. And what we're interested in there is, will people make mistakes where they'll say the pinky above the greenies are mimicked? And they do. Okay, so that's exactly what happens. Now what we also want to do is create a situation where we can elicit the reflexives. So here we have a different type of miming. So these aliens can mim, and when one alien mims another, the other alien's antenna lights up. So this is how it goes. So this guy wiggles, the bluey mims a pinky, and the greenie mims a bluey. Okay? And they can also mim themselves. So he wiggles and he mims himself, the pinky mims itself, the greenie mims itself. Okay, so you can use this to elicit the same sorts of things, and you can create these different configurations to elicit things like the bluey. So the bluey above the greenies are miming, and the bluey above the greenies mimmed itself. So we have side-by-side comparisons. And what you find here is exactly the same thing that was found in comprehension, is you get quite robust agreement attraction effects in agreement, but when you're eliciting reflexives, they dissipate, you get none of those, even though both involve agreement with plurals. So, contrary to what had been found before, we find that things come together and they line up nicely. What we also find is, in these sentences, because people are saying the same sentences, we can use a forced aligner to measure exactly how long it takes people to say each segment, each syllable, and each word, and measure where are people speeding up and where are they slowing down. And so we can look not only at the cases where people go wrong, but also all the cases where people say the right thing. And we see that even when people are saying the right thing, in the agreement case, they'll slow down because they're facing conflict. And in the reflexive case, they won't slow down because they're seeing no conflict. So these diverge nicely. Okay, so that's the end. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so the goal of what we're trying to do, and we're not all the way there yet, is to try and minimize the contribution of task-specific mechanisms to see if we can actually show that the same mechanisms can be deployed in speaking and understanding. And really the differences just come down to what information is available and what isn't. Okay? And the progress we've made in doing this involves, to some degree, inventing new paradigms. Sometimes we've just got new findings in those paradigms. But to a large extent, most of what we're doing is not that high-tech. We've done a lot of high-tech stuff, but really, the breakthrough in this case didn't involve coming up with some fancy new recording device or anything like that. The real breakthrough came from just figuring out how to ask the right questions, and how to break down the questions about how comprehension works and how production works into comparable mechanisms. So we see that different loci of uncertainty yields different choices, and that accounts for some contrasts. We can learn about the order of planning and comprehension production. I showed you some of this. I showed you something about how the memory access proceeds, and that's more similar in comprehension production than you might have concluded from some previous findings. The grain size, this is whether you're working on big or small pieces. I didn't tell you about that, but I'm happy to talk about that later. We found that in production, you can actually show the grain size of people working in pretty small chunks in production also. Okay? So thank you for your patience, and you managed to stay awake. Good job.
Thank you, dear Professor Phillips, for your insightful speech, and thank you all for listening. And now we can have a few questions from you.
Just speak, yeah.
So, going back to your first initial question, in the linguistic level, so what can you...
Could you turn on the microphone?
Yeah, can I do that?